Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Greg Greene, along with my co-host Edward Meehan. We're with the Laird Barron subreddit, and we're doing helping to lead this 2024 year-long read-along of Laird's horror collections and his novel, The Croning. We are thrilled to have Laird back with us for another webcast. Hi, Laird. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And we're going to dive into Swift to Chase, his phenomenal collection and very sophisticated collection. Swift to Chase, we've got a lot of questions there. Yeah, we have our copies in hand. I tell you what, I have never been so thankful for Kindle because I have used that find feature to go and cross-reference where I think someone is showing up or there's a reference to an idea or something. So that's been super helpful. But before we get into Swift to Chase, I just wanted to mention as well that we've got coming up this Tuesday, Laird's brand new collection, Not a Speck of Light, is coming from Bad Hand Books. A number of you probably will have already ordered it through Bad Hand with that signed book plate. But if you didn't do that, it is now ready to go on like Amazon and your local independent bookstore, everywhere else you can find it. I'm especially just delighted with not just that there's a collection of so many of Laird's awesome stories that hadn't been put together in a single book before, but also that it's illustrated by Trevor Henderson, aka Slimy Swamp Ghost on Twitter and Instagram. And we've just got some wonderful illustrations there. The Help Me Monster from In a Cavern in a Canyon. We've got the illustration from Girls Without Their Faces On. And also I pulled in one from The Glorification of Custer Poe, a real haunting one there. Laird, what were you thinking, or what was your reaction when you started seeing these images coming through?
That guy doesn't have his face on either.
Yeah. Yes, no face left at all there.
No, lovely. Henderson's really a great illustrator. So I was pleased that Doug talked him into doing it. It's been a great experience working with Doug in general. I'm pleased to have him as a publisher. He works really hard to try to put the books forth in their best possible light. And, I never really imagined having an illustrated, regular, traditional published book. But I do I think one illustration per story is really, I think that's a good touch.
Yeah, it looks really nice. I think Todd Kiesling,
he did the layout. Yeah,
did the layout and the typography and stuff. So
yeah, nice job. I don't have a copy of it yet.
Yeah.
So when I do, I'm anticipating how great it's going to be, though.
Yeah.
I've seen the digital proofs and whatnot. It's really a lovely looking book.
Copies are actually starting to get out into bookstores, apparently, and I know some members of the Laird Barron subreddit have gotten their copies. I expect I'll have mine any day now, and I'm so excited about that. And we'll mention at the end of the webcast, but we're doing a live webcast with Laird and Brian Evanson. Brian's book comes out also on Tuesday. It's called Good Night, Sleep Tight. So with both of these books, and I think Ellen Datlow's Fears anthology, and I'm sure a number of other books coming out on Tuesday, we just kind of had to bring that in. Yeah, it's we're real excited to talk to both Laird and Brian on Sunday. So yeah. In terms of this webcast, we'll go plan 60 to 90 minutes. We never stick to 60 minutes, but that's kind of my goal here, and we'll see how long it goes. And then folks who are watching, please be sure to throw your questions into the YouTube live chat, and we will pitch those questions to Laird. And you might mention the story, specifically the story. If you have a story-related question, you might throw in the title of the story, just so we're clear on that. So to start off with, the collection Swift to Chase. These are stories mostly of Jessica Mace, Julie Vellum, Steely J, Zane Toombs, Ed, and that circle of friends and enemies. And the stories were published originally across various magazines and anthologies from 2012 to 2016. And when assembled in Swift to Chase, of course, they form this complex mosaic, jumping from adolescence to adulthood to old age, jumping between generations, sometimes within the same story. So help us understand how that form of the collection took shape as it's being written over at least 4 years. Did you have like a master plan as you were starting to write, like with that at least first published story, Black Dog? How did that take place?
I did. A loose plan. We've talked about this in the past. When you try to track my stories, if you try to track them between the multiple universes that the stories inhabit, or how they relate to one another, I decided very early on that while I do want a lot of my stories to be related, and specifically in this collection, they're very tightly woven compared to others, I didn't necessarily want them to be 100% one-to-one. In other words, everything lines up neatly for two reasons. One, it would just be a colossal amount of work for varying degrees of return. And so also it's not necessarily satisfying. I sort of like the Aikman approach, where some stories are related to each other from collection to collection even, but there's this sort of almost counterintuitive way that the stories are related to one another. It's almost like obliquely. Like I said, I wanted kind of the best of both, or I wanted to have my cake and eat it too in this regard. I wanted them to line up, but I also wanted them to not. Occasionally, there's a puzzle piece left over, and you go, how does this fit? Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I feel like there needs to be, for me, I preferred there to be some reader agency, and I see it in play all these years later. The initial response, critically, some critics liked it; it sold fine, but a lot of my old fans were very confused by this collection, and perhaps even aggrieved in some cases, have I been made aware. But unlike a lot of my other stories, I've noticed that over the years now, this collection caused a lot of speculation, people trying to make it work rationally. So when I first began writing them, I knew that was going to be the case. I was going to try to write for the next several years. I figured 3 to 5 years I would write stories that were all more closely linked to one another than the prior collections had been. The prior collections are thematically linked, but I wanted this collection to actually have some connections between at least some of the stories that were direct, and that's how that happened. And people have asked me, how did you decide to section the stories? There's 3 sections in the book, and in some ways I was thinking of an album, but mostly I broke those up as kind of a guide. People do it with novels anyway, but sort of each section suggests a theme, and I think provides a little bit of a key for anybody who's confused to sort of interpret the overall kind of arc within each section.
You've described in the past Swift to Chase as something like a novel told in short stories. Was there? You mentioned Aikman just a moment ago, but was there like a novel or a collection that had done this before that you'd read that kind of served as a model for this?
No, and I'm not saying that I haven't. I don't consciously know.
Yep.
There obviously other collections have been segregated or compartmentalized. Often what authors do, especially if they've been writing for a long time, they'll have a collection: early work, middle work, recent work, or these are my science fiction stories in this section and my fantasy in this, which is what I'm going to do with my dark fantasy collection when I put it together. They'll be more segregated based on what type of fantasy they are, rather than this. This was slightly different. I haven't seen it done, but I would imagine someone has.
Just thinking about your first 3 collections, they're generally classified as cosmic horror, and genres are helpful. They're certainly helpful for marketing and helping set expectations. Hey, if you really like slasher fiction, here's a book for you that you'll like. And I find genre helpful in that sense, and helping connect to the right reader and understanding what a reader's expectations are. And sometimes trying to put something into a genre is not especially helpful, especially when it pushes the envelope some. But when we think about Swift to Chase, I mean, is there a genre, a subgenre that to you best describes it? I've heard psychological horror, occult thriller. How do you think of it in terms of that kind of genre positioning?
Well, it does encompass a lot more than my other collections did. I mean, the other collections were more focused in the sense of what, not thematically, but what genres they inhabited. And normally it was a couple. It would be like a historical combined with horror, or it would be a crime story combined with horror. These are do the same thing, but I think there's an overarching sense of weirdness that I think it's stronger, more palpable than there necessarily is in the other collections. I think the sense of rules, for me, cosmic horror, that's one of its limitations. I like, as much as I like it, when people hear cosmic horror, if they're horror fans, they start thinking H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith, William Hope Hodgson, Derleth, all that stuff. And to some degree, there are rules. The ineffable is quantified in a certain way, and I like that. I'm actually working on a few stories that actually do have that sort of rule. The idea that there are rules to the universe, and it changes the kind of fiction that it changes the impact of the horror. I feel like Swift to Chase is my. I'm having a hard time rereading the stories because I've been going over them for various reasons, especially when I was working on Not a Speck of Light, putting it together. It's my fantasy collection, believe it or not. All the Swift to Chase stuff is really, and Not a Speck of Light, are really important because of the characters that I port over to the fantasy universe. But Swift to Chase is really harsh, and part of the reason it's harsh is because it's just the rules are different. There may not even be any rules. It's much closer to. I hesitate to say real life. I don't want to trivialize, or take entertainment and try to say, oh, there's some profound meaning. But if I'm kind of disquieted by these stories after setting them aside for a few years, or even sickened in some cases, then it obviously, it was rough stuff. And I think part of the reason, though, is just that your footing's unsteady throughout. I succeeded in that regard. I remember Jessica asked me one time what my goal was with the collection. I said for it to be destabilizing, which
oh wow,
coincidentally is when I edited the year's best weird fiction for Michael Kelly years and years ago. That was one of our tasks. We were constantly bombarded with from reviewers and whatnot. But what is weird fiction? What is its intent? What is its primary effect? And I said it's a destabilizing sort of influence. Things are just not right. Could be good, could be ill, or could be positive, but the ground is unsteady beneath your feet. And that was one of the goals of, maybe the central goal of this collection, was I wanted people to be really uncomfortable on a surface level, but also on a sort of an instinctive level.
Yeah, it's interesting, that phrase, that idea of the ineffable is quantified. Like you're going to see, there's some rules that are established that now I see the truth behind the curtain. I understand now the rules of the universe, or the nature of the universe, or there's some big horrifying monster, or a whole race of monsters, or whatever. You start to get a clearer picture of what the makeup of the universe is, and it's deeply unsettling. But here it seems like with Swift to Chase, the stories are, it seems to me at least to kind of run that same deep, dark vein of cosmic horror, but it's the narrative focal depth is tighter. Well, of course, I mean, you really hone in on the experience, the inner experience of a one of your hard-boiled protagonists from Imago Sequence, for example. You focus, you hone in on their inner experience, but it seems like it's even even more focused, maybe, or tighter framing or something in Swift to Chase, where it's like, the key event a lot of these stories is a party going on at the Toombs place and in the basement there, and the experience of high school age girls, their bitter rivalry and hatred, and just kind of the growing sociopathic tendencies of high school and 20 guys in their high school years or their 20s or whatever. So yeah, but like there's still elements that are just like, there's like really bizarre horrific things going on that are not kind of a part of the normal world. So that's why when I kind of saw the phrase psychological horror as one subgenre that might apply to this, definitely, I knew that psychological horror is in there. Termination Dust is a great example of that, and yet there's still like very strange occult, supernatural, paranormal things going on as well.
Well, right, and that's why one of the sections is the golden age of slashing.
Yeah.
The idea was to take psychological horror, which I hadn't at that point delved into that much, and slasher fiction, grittier stuff, and then imbue it with something more otherworldly. So that was part of the destabilizing, gambit, is to take things that we think we know about. I mean, the slasher is, everybody knows the rules of the slasher, and my goal was no. What if we upend that? So in other words, I'm still working within a form. I mean, it's a genre book, and I didn't seek to try to create something that had never been done. My specialty and my interest is usually taking things that have been done to death in some cases, going, no. There's still something you can get out of this. There's another way we can turn. It's an object with multifaceted. Let's turn this until we see. There's something. There's something here. There's a speck over here that we have not mined. There's a section that we haven't mined. And that was kind of the goal there. I mean, I very specifically devoted a lot of it to cursed objects. There's a werewolf story. There's multiple references to serial killers. I mean, I've always done adjacent stuff, but this was like full on taking. No, there's a serial killer. We're going to explore what happens. What if I do a serial killer story?
Yeah, or a zombie story.
There's a zombie story.
Great zombie story in there.
Right. It's actually, in a lot of ways, it's more traditional. The basis for many of the stories is more traditional than my first three collections, right? Because not as many people are aware of Lovecraftian tropes. I mean, it's becoming a bigger and bigger thing, but everybody knows about vampires. I mean, everybody knows about zombies and werewolves, and they all know about slashers. We're kind of in this bubble where, well, H.P. Lovecraft, we all know how it works, but not everybody, not the wider audience. And I wanted to take things that are much more commercially popular or folklore, things like that are more widespread, and really mess with them.
Cool. Very nice. Very nice. Let's Edward, did you have something you wanted to ask about?
I did, and you guys are talking about two of the three. So somebody said Swift to Chase is influenced by MK Ultra, slashers, and psychological horror. Yeah. Was MK Ultra an influence on the conspiracy theories, the characters' experiences? Because the destabilizing, it sure feels like that's a conversation we're having, but was that intentional?
Yeah. And I'm no expert in MK Ultra or any other conspiracy theory. I have a layman's knowledge, maybe a little more because I come from Alaska, and that's a specialty up there, being paranoid about stuff. But we love to go down rabbit holes in Alaska. But I don't pretend to be some expert on the subject. However, I know enough to know what I want to do with it lurking in the background. And of course, it does come up in the last story in the collection, Tomahawk Park Survivors Raffle. That's not directly MK Ultra, but that's certainly But there's Project Blue Book, there's Majestic 12. These were all famous when I was a kid for UFOlogy, for CIA's research and special research and development division. And of course, the KGB was doing their own mind control. They were doing remote viewing, all this legendary stuff. And so yeah, that was, and you see it come to culminate. There's a reason why I end with the story that I end with, and it's about what it's about. It's taking all that conspiracy stuff and tying it into, what if the CIA had something to do with a Jason Voorhees type of character, or a Michael Myers character? What would they do? And what if the CIA was in cahoots with, this is one of the most famous and popular conspiracy theories, is what if, the Greys, were influencing what they were doing. So essentially CIA is running an op, and then somebody's running an op on the CIA.
Very good. Do you one last just general question before we move into specific stories? Is the nonlinear narrative in Swift to Chase, is it perhaps a way of playing on that frequent refrain about time? The time is a ring. Okay.
Yep. It serves multiple purposes, but you will notice that there's kind of a through line, because even though it's nonlinear and it goes this way and that, there's even a far future, or possibly far past science fiction story in the middle of that. It ends with everything slowly goes backward in time to the 1970s.
Yeah, that's right. Folks who are joining us online, of course, glad to have you here. Thrilled to have you here. Go ahead and post questions as you have them in the YouTube live chat window. Edward and I have some questions that we've kind of pulled from the Reddit sub community, or the subreddit community, to bring up here. But do add your own questions. So taking a look at the first couple of stories, Screaming Out Montana and LD50, and kind of drilling down into, or getting a little closer look at the character of Jessica Mace in particular. There are just so many things to comment on. I did want to, I guess, start with on Screaming Elk. Carnivals are maybe not as common today as they were when we were kids, but it was like going to carnivals. Was it something you guys did when you were young? And was that a fun experience, scary experience to you?
No, I never got to do anything like that when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there was a school carnival, but not a carnival with a Ferris wheel, the big, and a bunch of hungover carnies taping together rides and stuff. The only time I ever got to do that is actually in my early 20s, right? Not too long before I left Alaska. I went to the state fair 2 or 3 years in a row. So I mean, it's essentially the same thing. They just don't. They're lacking some of the more traditional exhibits, but So I had very little personal experience with that. I had to do some research, and they are still around. They're not as popular, but there are traveling carnivals.
Yeah, I've seen. I grew up with we'd have carnivals come through, or the circus or whatever, and I'm sure it does seem like it's kind of moved over to the state fair a lot. But it was just fun evoking the the magicians and the sleight of hand and the knife throwers and the strong man or strong woman in this case. That was a lot of fun. In this story, Jessica seems like she's pretty much a confirmed skeptic when it comes to the supernatural or paranormal in the story. But by the time we get to one of the stories about Jessica that you wrote later on, and it is, I think, a little bit later in her life as well, the story American Remake of a Japanese Ghost Story, it's pretty clear that she herself is having experiences that I would define as paranormal. Beasley makes kind of an intuitive off-the-cuff observation in Screaming Elk about Jessica, who he has just met, but of course she's kind of famous. Everyone knows her story as the survival of the killer, and it seems like maybe he's hitting the mark here with his theory. I'm just going to quote something real quick, a little short piece here. He says, Beasley says of her, Alaska was the crucible that made you. Your life ended when that man slashed your throat. The old you went up in smoke. You're a dancing star. I recognized your face the second I walked into the tavern, he says. What's more, I recognized the light in your eyes. I wasn't there looking for Ms. Goodbar or heroin to pull our fat from the fire. I went there to get drunk because we'd failed finding our leading lady for the big night. Meeting you is fate. Can't be anything less than the machinery of the universe clicking into place. did her that near I don't want to call it a near death experience necessarily, but her near fatal experience with the killer in Termination Dust, did it switch on something for her in some way?
Well, I have to be careful because there are by the nature of the collection, it sort of gets explained quite without directly explaining it in the last story of the collection. But essentially, and of course, it's complicated by the fact that there's more than one Jessica Mace, but or she exists in two places at once and has perhaps they might not have knowledge of each other, but they are sort of inhabiting on a quantum level. They're sort of inhabiting each other. Who one of them's dreaming the other, and then the other one's dreaming the other, type of thing. But you know, if you read the whole collection, it's quite obvious that her mother was something, you know, had been tampered with genetically. Everybody at that party had been, and I think it's quite plausible that it was something that slept in her, some genetic trigger that was waiting to be depressed at some point. And yeah, it's very possible that it did. It's very possible she died in that story.
Yeah, very good. Do you consider Jessica Mace to be? We talked about slashers and other well-known horror film genres in particular. But do you consider Jessica Mace to be like a reinvention of the Final Girl?
I consider her, and I consider her a professional final girl. That's kind of how she refers to herself sometimes. And as I develop her, because she comes back in Not a Speck of Light, there's two, like I said, there's two timelines. There's a story in the Not a Speck of Light, which we'll eventually get to that, down the road, but where, she seems to be working for powers there's a couple stories where she seems to be working for an organization, which is obviously not the case in any of these stories. But I also consider her somewhat of a superhero, like a very naturalistic superhero. She doesn't have super strength or anything like that, but she's obviously. Let me put it this way: somebody asked me, they said, who would win, her or Coleridge? I said, no, she'd kill Coleridge.
Yeah,
he wouldn't have a prayer, not because she's dangerous, but she doesn't have any special martial arts. She's probably a little more dangerous than the average person, but she's not a highly skilled combat specialist. She knows a few tricks. That's about it. And she's also quite ruthless. I could imagine Mace sticking somebody with a knife if she needed to, no problem. That's not what makes her dangerous. What makes her dangerous is put it this way. My conception for her is that her superpower is destiny.
Oh wow, yeah. I get that. Yes.
Yeah, you're not going to kill her. She will, she will prevail in some, and we're not even sure she can be killed. I'm not 100% convinced that when. Huh. Yeah, I knew somebody years ago that they swore that they had died once in a dream. They had fallen down the stairs and they broke their neck, and they.
Sorry, I think we lost your audio there. Can you still hear him?
No.
Sorry, Laird, we lost your audio there.
Laird, you might be muted. I see a little muted microphone by your name.
Okay, he's dropped out. He'll rejoin us in just a second. And while we're waiting for Laird to rejoin us, yes, thank you for Redcon Rex for pre-ordering Not a Speck of Light. I think I pre-ordered it about within the first hour that it became available. And
I ordered 5 of the signed copies.
Nice,
because I'm giving them away.
That's awesome. You have a book club, right?
Yeah. There's 7 people in total, but 2 of them are romantic couples, so we count 5 members because they have to share the book. So I got 4 extra ones for all the members.
Love it. That's awesome. Yeah. Advocating for the artists that you love. That's awesome. And Redcon Rex, I agree, more movies should be made out of Laird stories. And yes, Bad Wolf, not just the final professional final girl, but the final queen. So yes. We'll give Laird just a minute to jump back in here. But Edward, I know you had some questions about a question you wanted to ask about LD50, so we'll cue that up next. But it's thinking about Jessica as there being two Jessicas and one is dreaming the other, or maybe both of them are dreaming each other. It's really interesting. I think when we see Not a Speck of Light, there's the story that's called Swift to Chase, that is like Jessica as a superhero, and it's kind of I think written in the same vein as X's for Eyes, where you've got the Toombs family, and they've got it is kind of like a there we go. Hey Laird,
I have returned from the other side. Very
good. Glad to have you back. We were just talking about Jessica, like the story Swift to Chase that has Jessica in it, and that is like more of that kind of superhero mode. I think something more along the lines of X's for Eyes, that kind of Johnny Quest written for men's adventure magazines type thing.
Sure, and don't make me assume my ultimate form is in that setting.
Yes.
Just to wrap up my previous thought is the person really had this nervous system response to having died, but they obviously just had a dream or a vision or what have you, right? A hallucination. But, we talked about it. They were always interested in my work and about parallel universe. And they said, what if you die in this one and you just move one over? In other words, you just pick up. There's a glitch briefly and then you're just back. I always was fascinated with that. So I'll pretty much leave it at that about her. I think there's a lot. My conception with her was partially also the Jessica Fletcher thing, where no matter what small town she's in and Murder, She Wrote, there's a dead body. She's always around dead bodies. You don't want to be anywhere around Jessica Fletcher. And I was like, I wanted to play with that. We have that with all our mystery characters, all our private detectives. For there to be a story, no matter where they go, something has to be happening. And of course, in fiction, they don't usually acknowledge this. You just say, oh, well, Jessica, there's a lot of people die around Miss Fletcher, I guess, no biggie. I wanted to play with that idea with, why does she constantly run across problems? Sometimes she seeks them out, but it's a little deeper than that.
To have like a weekly TV series, that's a lot of dead bodies. At least the Die Hard films, the wife in the second one, I think second or third one, the wife's like, why do these things keep happening to us? And I think they felt like maybe they had to kind of address it to keep some sense of reality to the show. Edward, you wanted to ask a question.
I did. So I was thinking about Laird, Jessica Mace. And so, in my opinion, Imago Sequence is like this Cormac McCarthy, like super masculinity. It feels like a very masculine book. And I know that occultation became more diversified. It was a more diverse, wider cast of characters. When you started writing Jessica Mace, was this an effort to like include more femininity into your writing? I consider her to be kind of a masculine female character. She's got the scar on her neck. She survived a murder. She's pretty overtly sexual. Like she has kind of a air of sexuality. But what do you think about all that? I know it was kind of rambly.
No, I wasn't concerned with that, the femininity aspect, because I inject that when I want to, with other characters. I mean, it doesn't hurt to have a feminine lead, but it was more, my interest was with her was more the final girl, was to do something with the final girl. And also to give the final girl a little more agency right from the jump of a story, as opposed to, so in the initial story, she's the typical final girl. Bad things happen to her and she somehow survives. And that's it. Usually sometimes there's a sequel and they're like Neve Campbell in the Scream stories. Mm-hmm. I don't feel like that. Usually they're traumatized. That's kind of how the direction that they go. And then Jamie Lee Curtis, who knows? For all I know, those filmmakers are reading my mail, because obviously that all comes out well after Jessica Mace, the trilogy, Halloween Kills, Halloween Ends, all that. Where Jamie Lee Curtis is now just this double-barreled badass, just waiting for him all these years. she's not waiting in terror like she was in H2O. She's like waiting. She's got guns and knives and bombs, and but that's still paralysis. She's still, even though she's, even though Laurie Strode is loaded for bear and waiting for this guy, she's still waiting for him. Jessica Mace would go to the asylum and burn it. That would be her. And if she fried a few other inmates, she'd say, "I'm sorry, that's terrible," But she would be very much inclined to get on the staff and try to kill Michael Myers, or she'd make a Molotov cocktail, whatever. She'd be the one hijacking the ambulance when they're shipping him somewhere. She would not be sitting in her house waiting, just waiting for this to happen. That's the kind of the difference between her. She's, I feel like, and it's still, even though I wrote her years ago, 10, 12 years ago when I first started writing her, I still feel like she's an evolution ahead of what most people are doing with the serial killer. Or, excuse me, with the final girl.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. One other question about LD50 specifically. LD50 is a chemical measure. It's a measure of toxicity. It's a lethal dose. It's when a substance would kill 50% of
Right.
a test audience. A lethal dose that would affect 50%. So as a measure of toxicity? Is that like an allusion to the toxic masculinity that you find in this backwoods region with Hoyle and a number of other kind of unsavory characters that she finds?
Right. I mean, she's out machoed by far in this story. In some of the other stories, she's sort of the alpha.
Yeah.
Or at least holds her own. But I'm not going to reveal why. I will say this though: there's a couple sentences early on in the story that ties into LD50, although it's not necessarily the reason for the title, but there is a direct reference to the title, like in the first 2 pages.
Okay.
But most people don't catch it. It just it flies right under the radar.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we're all on an Easter egg hunt now. So let's. I'll have to go back and look at that story and see if I can catch that reference. Thank you. Awesome. Great.
And by the way, it's based on a true story.
Oh my gosh! Of a serial killer of dogs.
Yep. Really quickly, I try to write about things that disturb me the most, and I'm sorry, I'm one of those twisted people that I'm far more disturbed by someone who goes around icing dogs than I am someone who ices people. I mean, they're both terrible, but I was far more disturbed by this story than I am typically. And I want to say it was taking place in Idaho right around that time. It was 2012, 2013, somewhere in there. And it was just a little news story. Someone had killed upward of 90 plus dogs over a short period of time somewhere in Idaho. It was the point where, and of course, the authorities are looking at it more rationally. They're like, what if he starts killing people? I'm like, no, he's killing all these dogs. Let's stop him. They're all like, oh, he's going to graduate to people. I'm like, no, it's bad enough already. And whoever was doing it was killing dogs in people's yards, kidnapping them. They were finding them. Sorry, trigger warning a little belatedly, everybody. But they were finding them buried in shallow graves with their feet sticking out. It was, and I never heard any follow-up to it, but it was over 90, and they think it may have been as much as like 150, 200 that this person had killed. They were just like flat out annihilating whole packs of dogs. And that really bothered me. It really got under my skin reading that. And I decided that it would most likely bother Jessica as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No doubt. No doubt. And they never. So they never, as far as you know, found the person. They don't know what the rationale was. There's some suspicion in LD, at least gossip, local gossip, that it's some kind of satanic or occultic worship or something.
I don't. We could be, and some of that I could have gotten from the article, because the sheriff was definitely, when they interviewed the sheriff for the article, he was a really unhappy person. And yeah, I think people were tossing. I mean, that's what people do. They would have 100 different reasons, when the most likely is just someone doesn't like dogs and they're a psychopath.
Yeah.
Or I should say a sociopath in this case. But yeah, so it was based loosely on that news story. I just ran with that.
the way I read the end, it seems pretty clear that she has left Hoyle paralyzed. He's broken his spine or whatever, and has not just left him sitting in his backyard. He's on top of one of the ant piles, and he's starting to brush them off of him. Like she's leaving him to be eaten by ants, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, she did.
Right.
And you might quibble with whether there are fire ants that far north, but I decided that I took poetic license. They're working their way up the coast.
Yes.
So I'm like, they were there. Good enough. They're
Along
mean.
with the
they would definitely eat you if you sat still long enough.
Yes. Yeah. Totally. Working the way up along with the armadillos and everything else.
Yeah, the killer bees. So the African honeybee has been working its way up the coast for a while. But there's a ruthlessness in Jessica Mace that even Coleridge doesn't. Ex-mafia hitter does not. Well, she's not a professional. She may be a professional final girl, but that's kind of her conception. But she's not a professional killer. She's just a mean, angry, wounded person. Where Coleridge is, no, I do this for a living. I have my problems, but it's a job, and I have certain standards of behavior. Jessica has no regulator on her, like what she's capable of. Jessica does not have a regulator.
And Coleridge really becomes a father figure by the time we get to the novel Worse Angels. He's a father figure to the boy's name is Declan, is that right? Devlin, that's it. To Devlin, and I'm not sure that I could see Jessica ever like being that parental or maternal to.
No, don't get me wrong. She's not evil. Like she wouldn't. Yeah. I don't think she would take an innocent person and sacrifice them to catch somebody. But if you're in her way, you might get mowed down. Like in other words, she's not going to. Collateral damage is not beyond her, capability. She's not quite a sociopath or psychopath, but she's definitely damaged goods.
I think in Dungeons and Dragons they would call that chaotic good.
Yeah.
Does that sound right? Chaotic good.
Yeah. She's and she is afraid. I mean, that's one of the things that she just takes her fear and masters it. But she certainly is afraid. That's what makes her, and Coleridge increasingly, because he's becoming afraid now as I'm working through these stories with him, because he's starting to get to where she is. He hasn't gotten there yet, but I perceive him as becoming more and more erratic as he becomes afraid. Fear will do that to you.
Yeah.
It will allow you to justify anger and fear. Anger, fear, love, the three big ones. They will. Most people will justify almost anything in service of those big emotions at some point, if it goes on long enough. Yeah. The love of children. I had to massacre that village because my son, it had to come first. Family had to come first. Fear. Well, what's the old trope? What will men do in the face of fear? Almost anything. And of course, anger. Anger justifies any burning any bridge, any building, any society down. So she's very dangerous.
Jumping to termination dust, there's so much. You said recently, I think on a call with some of the Patreon folks, if you had to put 10 stories in a time capsule to be remembered by, Andy Kaufman, Creeping Through the Trees, and Termination Dust would be on that list. And those are our next two stories in the collection. Termination Dust is just this tour de force of narrative sophistication. It's like the story achieves in microcosm what the collection as a whole achieves, which is this complex braiding of threads. Earlier today, I was thinking it's almost like George Seurat doing, inventing pointillism. You're creating this distributed tapestry across all of these stories. And anyway, there's so much that could be that we could ask about or that could be said about it. But just give us a sense of what you were trying. What did you set out to achieve in writing Termination Dust? And do you feel like you achieved it?
Well, what happened is Ross Lockhart of Word Horde, he had just started his press back then, and he was doing he asked me to submit to Jack the Ripper anthology.
Yeah.
So I knew right then that I wanted to do something that I didn't think anybody else would think of for that. Namely, it's not going to be about Jack the Ripper. It'll reference Jack the Ripper at some point, but it'll be more in the spirit of, you know, this evil that's preying upon a group of people. And you know, that's the first story that Jessica Mace appears in. She certainly was not the main character in the story. I didn't know if I'd ever write about her again. It was simply I really liked her character and ended up developing that character later. But at the time, I had no attachment to anybody or anything going on in the
Wow.
story.
Wow.
That's actually where I feel like I started creating my non Imago sequence universe. Like that's where I really took off because it is one of the first stories I wrote for Swift to Chase, and it kind of establishes, okay, this is not going to be like the previous stories. Same universes, but different, but a different story, a different lore that would eventually, hopefully, tie into the stuff I'd done before, but in a very tenuous way most of the time. So yeah, I was actually when I was writing that story, I was almost setting out in my mind some of the hallmarks of what I was going to work on for the next couple books. That Swift to Chase and Not a Speck of Light. And yeah, I don't know if I accomplished it all or not. I really do think it's one of my best stories. It's a lot harder to juggle that kind of a story than maybe it seems. Also, I don't write a lot of stories traditionally where I focus on a large group of characters that you get into their heads.
Yes, yes.
I'll have big groups of characters in a story, and you may speak with them or see them do things, but very seldom in my career prior to that point, and really not even since, do I do too many stories where we jump around and we get different perspectives. So I wanted to do an ensemble story. I wanted to do a story that was like in a lot of scenes, like a tracking shot, unbroken tracking shot, but also just where you could fly around like a fly on the wall and get inside, be peering over the shoulder of a large cast. And that kind of, for me, it sets the tone in a lot of ways for what's to come in the rest of the book. The only reason I didn't open with it is because I had to make a decision, aesthetically, would that be a cool story to open with versus, no, I'm telling these we're going backwards in time. Like I said, there's some deviations, but it's like the ocean, the water goes out and it rushes in, then it goes back out again. The tide's still going out, but you still have some waves coming in. That was my goal, was to constantly be going backwards. So that was the first story I wrote about her, but chronologically it had to be, where it was in the collection.
There's you had mentioned on I think a previous call, again, I think one of the Patreon calls, that the killer, in turn, the one who actually attacks, of course, we are going back and forth in time. There's a couple of different killers who are referenced here, but you did answer the question as to whether or not the killer is in the supporting cast. Have we actually seen him, or is he just an invisible figure the whole time? And I'm not going to spoil it.
Right.
Go and take a close look at it. But you did mention that, there's actually a clue in there. You can track down who the person is. But let me ask this. I mean, and of course Jessica ends up taking him down. But it's you don't make the identity clear. There's not this clear, oh, here's the monster revealed and let's take him down. It's just so you leave that identity pretty hard to find. Why take that approach? I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but why wasn't it more clear who the killer was and who he is when she actually shoots him?
Right. There's several reasons of varying importance or interest, but part of it is the overall reason is I wanted to frustrate throughout the collection. I think, judging from the aggrieved responses, I wanted to frustrate expectations the unspoken compact between reader and writer that I'm going to give you, it's a mystery, but I'm going to reveal what it is. No, I'm not. I might kind of hint at it. You're going to dangle, buddy.
Nice.
Because I don't, I had a purpose in mind for the story, like things that I'm focused on. I didn't care. To me, it doesn't matter who the big bad wolf is. What's the most fun part of any? I won't say mystery, but like of a slasher.
It's the chase.
The chase and
running through the
it
woods.
could be Bill, it could be Martha,
Yeah.
it could be the priest, it could be. I wanted to leave it to where one kind of reader would just be, you're trapped in that nightmare, and you'll notice it keeps coming back to this. The whole collection is like a nightmare treadmill. You can't get off. It's like you keep returning to this nightmare room, and you think, and you go. It's like a hub, and you go out to another nightmare, and you kind of wake up to the center of the nightmare again. And then you're shut it off to another room. It's the boat ride in Charlie and Chocolate, or Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, but it never ends type of thing. Gene Wilder just he has another evil ditty to sing to you when you get back to the base camp. But so ultimately, I wanted the journey to be much more important than the specific. But I also felt one of the things that I love about serial killer stories is if there's any ambiguity in it. Jagged Edge actually does that. I don't know if anybody remembers that. Jeff Bridges back in the 80s. And
yeah.
He's committed some gruesome murders, maybe. Evidence looks pretty bad.
Yeah.
And his attorney, she's just absolutely like, no, you didn't do it. And it goes back and forth at the very end. Spoilers, everyone. The killer's still out there, but he's out on bail or whatever. So it could be him, maybe not. But she ends up shooting the assailant. And there's a scene where the person's being covered with a body bag, but they're upside down. You know how it's very difficult to determine what someone looks like upside down, camera angle. And it was left ambiguous. If I recall, I mean, it's been 30, 40 years since I watched, almost 40 years, but I was blown away by that. I'm sure that you could freeze that and try to figure out if that really was Jeff Bridges, really was the bad guy. But he was and he wasn't. And I love that idea. But to be fair, I do reveal who the killer is if you look closely.
Yes.
The problem with it is it doesn't matter who the killer is, because one of the things that I folded into that story, it has serial killers, so it's a slasher, almost like a giallo. It's a weird fiction story, and it's a genius loci story, which is my favorite thing to write about.
Yes.
The idea is that obviously whoever she shot wasn't the end of it, because later in the story, somebody's still chasing her, and she's an old woman.
Yes. And leaves behind a token from that episode there at the Fraser Estates,
Right.
in the form of that hat. And you mentioned genius loci. I in trying to make some sense of Termination Dust and try to describe it. It seems like a diseased place, and to me, like not naming the killer, or not putting the killer up front and center at the end and showing him, we caught him, he's dead, or he escaped, or whatever. You just are left with more of a focus on the place and the people who keep cycling through here. And there's just like tiny little snippet at the end, toward the end, about a young woman who tells her brother, "Hey, I'm going to move to Eagle Talon," and he's like, "Don't do that. That's a dangerous place." And she moves there anyway. She's found dead, like 3 months later, or whatever. She's been left dead in place. It's just bits and pieces of people moving into this Whittier, Alaska style town community building, basically a single building, and they're just going into a grinding machine, really. But it's all like a diseased place. The genius loci kind of idea of there's a geolocative disease, I guess. But to me, that's the fact that you're not leaving it with that nice, clean, crisp ending of, yep, here's the killer and we got him, lets you focus more on the experience of the people who just keep cycling through here and experiencing these bizarre events.
Right. It's not the intention is not, it's not a feel good book. It's, I want you to feel despair as much as a book, that I'm capable of of engendering that response. It's it's supposed to disturb you, and also it does follow slasher tradition. They kill the guy, but then he rises again.
Yeah.
Well, in this case, something rises again. You know,
Yeah.
that's one thing about the serial killer, especially the famous stuff like Voorhees, Friday the 13th, and Michael Myers. The idea, and Freddy,
Yeah.
Nightmare on Elm Street. Their physical incarnation is just that. Whatever's powering them is a otherworldly force.
Yeah.
It's not. It is not simply a psycho. It is a demonic entity inhabiting a skin suit. So
yes.
I was I was cognizant of all this stuff when I wrote it. So anyway, I built that's sort of the building block of the collection, though, in general.
Yes. It's I think a magnificent achievement. And speaking of creepy and disturbing, Andy Kaufman creeping through the trees. You mentioned that this is one of your very favorite stories,
Yep.
Most successful from a craft perspective. One of my creepiest. You said. What was your first exposure to Andy Kaufman, and did you find him creepy? Did you personally find him creepy?
Yes. The uncanny valley of Andy Kaufman, I think.
Out of makeup, out of costume, it's just his face doesn't look like it's on quite right. I mean, or there's some kind of there's something going on there.
It's his affectation, his affect. He was a master at I'm joking. Am I joking?
Yes, yes.
That kind of thing. And then of course I'm joking. But I'm joking about joking.
Yes.
He would play it to the hilt. To the point where, from what I understand, this could just be, apocryphal, but it also would still suit my point because he engenders this myth-making instinct in everybody around him. So even if this is all people just making up stories of like how many people, especially just comedians, are these stories just keep the boogeyman, Krampus, Santa Claus.
Yes.
How many people engender Elvis is about one of the only ones I can think of off the top of my head. But and Kaufman was no Elvis. But the thing about it is that even he had that long running fake feud with the wrestler
Jerry Lawler. Yeah.
Lawler. That turns out that Lawler, even out of respect to him, carried it on for a certain amount of time after he died. They said,
wow.
well, they said, we found out that it was a sham, your feud. So what do you have to say now that he's dead? And he started cussing out Andy Kaufman and saying, you know what, that may or may not have been for money, but he's still a creep. And I'll tell you why. And all these things that he hated about him for real. And it turned out that was a lie too.
Wow.
So, right? I mean, there's something going on with, he emanated something that caused people to behave in ways that are, that's a really unusual, that's K-Fobby taken to quite the extreme.
Yes.
So I watched him as a kid, and kids see things. Sometimes I think, obviously kids mistake things, but I think kids also have a habit of seeing very clearly sometimes, especially when it comes to bullshit. And I'm 7, 8 years old, and he would come on TV in whatever capacity. I was afraid of him, and I wasn't afraid. I was watching horror movies, and they didn't scare me as much as he did. He bothered me in a way that I could not really articulate.
Yes.
And as an adult, I now look at it and go, it's the falseness of the uncanny valley. He's always just a tiny bit off in his insincerity. He's playing like a triple game with you. It's like a triple cross, and I decided that in Termination Dust, one of the characters, the deputy there, was hallucinating the King of Pop.
Yeah.
And I had determined, in a couple of years after having written that story, that there's something out there, whether it's a physical force or whether it's an occult force, the genius loci, but that it manifests as dead celebrities, that it enjoys messing with people. Why appear as a creepy, incorporeal thing when you could be Elvis? It's Elvis chatting with you, kind of like in another influence there was True Romance with Christian Slater and
It's a
everybody.
great movie.
Yeah, and you remember that Christian Slater's character, old Clarence, he kept hallucinating Elvis. I always loved you, Clarence. Always will. And you never see his face. And I can't remember what famous actor was playing him.
Val Kilmer.
Yeah, okay. The point, I always thought that was ominous because there's something wrong with Clarence. Clarence is not all right. And I think Clarence is probably dying of a tumor or something. I have no doubt that something is really terminal with him. And I said, oh, that's a really interesting idea. I mean, it's pretty common, right? The hallucinatory friend, the person that is your kind of like your id talking to you or whatever. So I said, oh, I'm going to play with that. But what if it's manifest in the world? What if it's not an internal, you don't have a tumor? What if it really is just something that takes place of, or takes advantage of your weakness, your fear, whatever it is? And why wouldn't it amuse itself by being Andy Kaufman or whomever? Don Rickles or something. I thought that would just add a weird, there's no accounting for why these things do what they do.
Yeah.
So, right. So I write that story and it's just the duplicity of Kaufman with the whole, he had all these characters he played. And then there was the Tony Clifton thing. Multiple people were in on that with him. Sometimes he was Tony Clifton, but other times he would have one of his friends play Tony, made up looking exactly like that character. And then he would fake interview him and all this. And I just said, oh, there's so many levels to this. I could, I have to try. I didn't know if I could pull it off. I was pretty scared actually while I was writing it, but
wow.
I feel like it did turn out kind of pretty close to what I had hoped.
It is very creepy, but also it's really quite funny at the same time. Julie Vellum is quite a character. I wonder, one, was Julie modeled on someone you knew or on a celebrity? I mean, she's just such a well-defined character and a lot of fun to listen to. And why choose her as the protagonist for the story? You've got the Steely J and what's going on with the Andy Kaufman figure, the leeches, all these bizarre things. There's a lot of kind of masculine energy in the background, but then you've got Julie V, who's really the protagonist and is the one who's like narrating this and experiencing this and visualizing it for us. Tell us a little bit about inventing Julie Vellum.
Yeah, and Julie V, I think, is pretty much a girly girl. I mean, she's vicious, but women can be very much bad. And she's athletic, but she's no fighting machine, nothing like that. She's definitely the opposite in many ways of Jessica Mace, who's her arch enemy. I didn't base her. It's funny. I didn't base her on any particular person, except for some of her bullying. You start realizing that she has reasons to be a bully, that there are ameliorating or mitigating circumstances. Not enough that it justifies some of the bad things she's allegedly done, but her dad's dying of cancer, and she loves her cat, and she's loyal to she's definitely loyal to her dad, and maybe to her mother. It's hard to tell. She keeps her word about things. She's just she's kind of struggling, and at this point, she's not a supervillain or anything like that. She's just a troubled, she's got troubles. And I based that part on a bully that I had to deal with a lot when I was in grade school before we moved out in the woods. There was a kid who was a couple years older than me. First day of school, he just beat the living snot out of me. I mean, I didn't even do anything. He flat out, and I was quite capable of being a mouth, but nope, he just came up and thrashed me, broke my glasses. I wore glasses back then. I was just trashed. And this little boy comes up to me, and I'm sitting there, and I could do nothing. The kid was like twice my size. So he runs off, and I'm sitting there in the dirt, and this little boy comes up and starts brushing the dirt off. He says, "It's okay." He does that to everybody.
Wow.
And my reaction, obviously I was afraid. I was ashamed. My beautiful new clothes. That was first day of school. I mean, my God, right? But my burning in my mind was vengeance. That's maybe I'm an old.
Oh, okay. We lost the sound again there, Laird. Sorry. We lost your sound again. Hey, we're sorry, we can't hear you. We lost your sound there. Yep. Yep. We'll come back. So we'll have another brief intermission for a second, and yeah, there we go. I do have another question specifically about Andy Kaufman, and then you want to take Arter.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Great. Quite illuminating. Oh man, if that kid went and beat up everybody, like where were the grown-ups? Like if the kid goes and beats up I don't get that.
Where were the teachers? Where was anybody?
Yeah, so bizarre. Redcon Rex, if we have time, I'm gonna bring up your question about Swift to Chase, his writing of Swift to Chase, and people putting down his novels. And I completely agree that ears prick up. It's one of 4 Rex stories, and it is
Technically 5.
What's the 5th one?
I count Eyes Like Evil Prisms. It's a
not just focused on him, but he's definitely in there. Yeah. Gundam Rex, right? I think is in there. So yeah.
I think it's second disc. It's a variant, but I included it in the Pantheon.
Yes. And Redcon Rex has a blue healer named Ripper. Wow. We're a cat family in my house, and I have 2 new kittens, and we completely adore them. But yeah, it's been wonderful. We had dogs at my house growing up, and I have never seen dogs in a better light as much as I enjoyed growing up with them. I've never seen dogs in a better light than I have in Laird's stories. It's really very touching to see like Minerva, his stand-in for Athena, show up in Frontier Death Song and in so many other stories. So yeah. All right, welcome back.
Sorry guys, my computer keeps freezing. There's something, it doesn't like this connection, but just to finish that story, and why I wrote about it, it's a circuitous reason why I wrote about Julie V is that, so I had this battle with him off and on for 3 years. So I was in 3rd grade, and I finally was able to stand up to him physically. And he was still bigger and stronger, but I had managed to kind of get a couple licks in on him one time, because this went on. I mean, he was kind of terrorized me a lot. And of course, my response to him was always, instead of cowing down to him, I'd run it to a distance and throw rocks at him. I used to run up behind him, and kick his knee out from behind. Anything I could. I hit him with a lunchbox one time and then run because I couldn't handle him in a fight. But I was always I was like trying to give back because I was scared to go to school.
Yeah.
Until one day, toward the end of the 3rd grade, and of course I never went back to that school again because we moved out in the woods. His mother showed up, and they were standing in the hallway. And I remember I was walking past, and she was looking at some test he had taken, and he was not a very good student. And she grabbed him by the scruff of his his lapels, and she slammed him up against the wall. Right? And literally the head banged off the wall, and she was doing that thing with it, with parents that are abusive don't want to be overheard, but she just was close up to her face was just next to his, and she was cussing him out and telling him what was going to happen to him when he got home and all this. And I actually stopped and was staring at him, and she got embarrassed, and then they walked off. She had him by the wrist. She was just grinding his wrist as they walked away, and he was sobbing. He was literally like a little baby. And instead of feeling contempt, because that was my initial response was, at last, victory. I said, this is why he's this way. It was a really adult thought, and then I never saw him again. But that made me years and years later. I mean, I've internalized this. This is 40 something years ago. Julie Vellum, you only ever hear about her from the point of view of people who don't like her, chiefly Jessica. And I just felt like, no, I'm going to tell a story from her point of view, not to justify her actions, but to humanize her.
Yes.
Exactly. There's a reason why she is the way she is.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. That's really interesting, and what a story there. One other question that I had about Andy Kaufman is that when we get to Steely J's house, the front door has a crescent moon symbol on it. In the basement, the greenhouse area, there are crescent moons decorating the area.
Sure, there are.
Yes, but they're described as reverse C crescent moons, and Steely J and company are using leeches in this bleeding and gorging process. Of course, the seasoned Laird Barron reader is going to look at that and see the broken ring and old leech. Is there any? Am I just making up stuff here, or is there some sort of a connection there?
Sure.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
Very good.
But
Very good.
I wrote it the way I wrote it because I feel like if this is the first Laird Barron joint you've encountered, it's not important for you to know what that is. I wanted the story to work. It didn't matter.
Totally.
Because actually a lot of people would go, oh, it's like on a wizard's cloak, or it's, maybe there's werewolves, or it's like it's alchemical or mystical. And that works fine. That's another thing going on with a lot of my stories. I want them to work. I love it when people argue over what they're about, because a lot of times I'm like, you're wrong, or you're right. So are you.
Yeah, absolutely. We did have one question, Redcon Rex, and he just says, was making Swift to Chase written that way. He just referenced the fact that it's a collection of short stories, but really by the time you get toward the end, you realize, no, this really is a novel. Was writing Swift to Chase that way to shut the critics up about at that time about praising your short stories, but putting down your novels for no good reason. That would be, I mean, by that point, of course, you had The Croning and The Light is the Darkness. Any response to that?
No, I mean, that's a good thought. You can't shut critics up.
Yeah.
They'll come at you for something, they still say that. And I've written, the thing is it's hard to even, how do you criticize somebody who only has 1.5 novels? I mean, you can criticize those novels, but I think it's a little premature to say whether this person can write novels or not. You can only say, hey, I didn't like The Croning. Let's see what he does next. But no, that's not why I did it. It wouldn't have worked anyway, but I do appreciate the thought.
Awesome. And one other thing about Andy Kaufman, the very end, and I'm asking this because I saw someone when I was reviewing the Reddit thread, someone took the end a little bit differently than I did. So I just want to clear it up. Mike, it's Rocco and Mike walk into Steely J's house, or no, into the tombs, into Steely J's house, go down into the basement. And when Julie V comes in, she sees her boyfriend sitting there in this pool being, I think, drained of blood. One of the other Redditors thought that they were read that as her two high school, her boyfriend and his friend, are participating in this exercise with leeches. I looked at it as, they've just gotten like knocked out and they're being drained of their blood for the benefit of the Andy Kaufman and Steely J and stuff. It was this are Mike and Rocco's participation there voluntary, or have they been like subdued and being drained of their blood?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
I think both interpretations are equally valid. I will say this. You'll notice that one of the characters, the only thing she can determine is that his feet are sticking out from behind the couch. So we don't know what his state is.
Right.
And there's another story from several years before that collection where it's the last story in the collection, and the character sees another character's feet sticking out from behind a piece of furniture. So there's that going on too. But whether they're being overpowered or whether they are sort of drugged and participating on some level, I think that doesn't require an answer.
All right, very good. Thank you. Awesome. Yes. Let me see. Jump into Ardor. Edward, you did the write-up on this. I'd love for you to kind of take this.
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts and questions. Laird, in one of our previous webcasts with you, you had made a comment that in the collections, there were stories that were bridges to future stories. I assume there were also bridges to past stories. Like, I felt like the Redfield Girls very much could have been in Occultation, but it was in The Beautiful Thing That Awaits Us All.
Absolutely.
Was Ardor the reverse bridge to The Beautiful Thing That Awaits Us All? Because Greg and I were talking, and he made the comment, I'm stealing this from him, but it seems like it would fit so nicely into The Beautiful Thing. We found it in Swift to Chase. Was that intentional? Was that just what we thought?
It was semi-intentional. It wasn't a master plan. I can't take credit to that degree, but you will notice that the main character is related to somebody from The Beautiful Thing. So I
He's
think
his grandson.
right, and that kind of imbues, and also the idea of chasing someone that's sort of a cursed figure to do with Hollywood or stage magic, or you know what I mean, performance kind of stuff. So there are some intentional connections, but I didn't necessarily mean for it to be in a meaning, like it wasn't intended to be some kind of secret and really meaningful connection. It's that happens to be the way that I write. Like you could actually take 30 from occultation, and that would have fit in Swift to Chase even better in some ways.
Yeah, I can see that.
It felt very much. On the Reddit, I did Ardor and Slave Arm, which have similarities. It feels very much like cosmic horror.
Yeah.
I guess there were all these aggrieved people in 2016 that said he's not rated cosmic horror. Some of it felt like cosmic horror.
Those two for sure.
Yep.
One thing that I was curious about, and I actually bookmarked it, there's this scene where he turns into the Vitruvian Man. He goes to the stag party where they're watching the porno film, and he says to the guy, like, the guy's like, "What are you doing here?" And he's like, "Well, what do you mean? You invited me." But then there's this whole like blood-soaked Vitruvian Man. I read this thing a bunch of times, and I could not for the life of me determine what happened. And you don't have to tell us. I'm so curious about that very specific scene.
I don't want to ruin it that way, but I will say that, how should I put this? I have an idea of what time travel would be interesting if it if it resembled a certain thing I have in my mind. In other words, when I visualize what would happen if you met yourself in the past, right? That there might be, and also the idea that there are parallel universes, that we're having this conversation, infinite variation, minuscule variation of this conversation at the same time. I have a tendency to think that if that is the case, which seems to be some scientists believe that there's a possibility that there are infinite realities, that it's less like you have a dinosaur head because you evolved differently in the next universe over. It would be, no, we're having this exact same conversation. Maybe the farther out you get, relatively speaking, that there would be greater changes. So I think of everything naturalistically. And so that scene has a lot to do with someone who's coming and going. It's my way of trying to conceptualize what would happen if somebody actually was traveling through time. And it would be organic. That's another, thing I've talked to people about. For me, a lot of not always, but often when I talk about time travel or extra dimensional space, in my gritty universe, it's all bleeding and flesh, and in the broadsword, Pershing crawls through a womb almost. Or maybe that's what it is. In the forest, in occultation, he crawls into this nautilus, and it's a womb. It's fleshy. It's that kind of a thing, and there's blood and there's fluid. Everything's about being eaten and digested and excreted, sweated out. The siphon, from the beautiful thing. The blood is pulled like with gravity, just sucks the blood out of your body. And this is like, if anything, why this story probably reminds people who've paid really close attention to my earlier work is because it's definitely playing with that idea of cosmic horror being grisly as opposed to an illuminating experience, which I like that too. I'm working on stories where it's much cleaner. It's all about energy. But you'll notice that most of my stories where you're subsumed by the cosmos, you're ingested essentially.
Viscera and effluvia.
Yeah, or if you travel through a threshold, it's a membrane. So I wouldn't say that there's a lot of importance to that in the sense of there's some secret meaning, but it's because to me imagery is as much how it sounds and how it looks, and the images that may not even be related directly to the plot are just as important. Like I feel like in movie cinema, color schemes, and I think sometimes students will look at that, art students will look at it, or film students will go, oh, he's trying to signify this or that, and that may be true. If a character is bathed in red light or something, maybe it really is so gauche as, oh, it's because the blood he's about to let. I don't think it even has to go that far. I think it could just be, as long as it's triggering your mind, your subconscious mind. I think it's done what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
I want people to have the experience I have when I'm watching a Bergman or Scorsese or Refn, where my mind is trying to operate on two or more tracks at once.
Yeah.
That there's a surface level where I'm enjoying it. There's a secondary level where I'm trying to interpret it. And there's a tertiary level, which is, for me, just as important, where I'm having a primal response that I can't even describe to it. And it's the thing that wakes me up in the middle of the night going, oh, I hadn't even thought about this. Why do I feel this way? That's as important to me as, oh, no, the color represents this. The Vitruvian Man represents that.
Mhm.
But it certainly does tie into time travel.
There was a specific, and it was in the film, you were talking about Dracula's fangs being genius loci. That felt self-referential to me when I read it, because you've done so many and you've reported writing about the genius loci. Was that intentional?
I'd have to look at the story again and see. There's one thread that I've been working on with vampires, is that they actually are, and you see it in my fantasy settings. I don't talk about it directly as much in the contemporary horror, but that vampires are black holes made.
Yeah, that's what was going on here too.
Yeah, that basically, when you run into what we consider a traditional vampire, you're not running into an undead, a walking corpse that still has some, maybe the occult forces are powering it. No, you're dealing with basically a physiological, or astrophysical construct. You're working with an event horizon of some kind, which also works for all kinds of levels for metaphors. But literally, what would happen if a black hole, a tiny pinprick black hole, was on Earth, and then what would happen if it had gained sentience?
Mm-hmm.
Like, in other words, a singularity. It assumes consciousness of everything that it's ever consumed, and maybe even generate some sort of algorithmic kind of consciousness. And there you go. And in the fantasy setting, of course, the way that it can move around is it may be a stable, like it's in one spot always, anchored, like in that cavern possibly, but it can project a holographic us, represent an avatar. That much like the holodeck in Star Trek: The Next Generation, the holograms could kill you because they had an electromagnetic substance to them. They had force. It wasn't just a vaporous image. They actually had the ability to, if you conjured a Borg, Data was almost destroyed by one. He said, empower it by 20% more, 20% stronger until it almost got him. I always thought, wow, that would be neat to do that if a black hole could just eject. Because they talk about black holes ejecting some of the material they've consumed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just thought, take a black hole and turn it into a monster.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. We real quick question before we jump on to The Worms Crawl In. Our viewer Nunya asks, how old was Laird when he started writing?
5
years old. Yep.
I real quick.
I think you said almost before you could read, you were writing.
I couldn't read.
Wow.
I drew and I would scroll. I would put, hieroglyphics basically. I didn't learn to read till I was 6. I wrote my first coherent story when I was 6, and I wrote until I was in my early 20s, and then I took a few years off to do other things, and I started writing again when I was 28, almost 29. So I'm 54. I conservatively have been writing for 49 years.
Wow.
Over 1 million words at this point, I think you've said?
Well, I wrote 1 million, I would guess, in the neighborhood of 1 million words before I turned 18.
Wow.
By hand. I wrote a 280,000 word trunk novel when I was in my late 20s. And then I've published over 1 million. We'd have to sit down and count the books, but I have like 10 published books and then some novellas. Yeah, it's well over 1 million words. I'm heading toward 2 million. probably.
Wow.
Awesome. Jump into The Worms Crawl In. At first blush, it seems like a reinvention of the zombie genre, but when I really thought, reread it, looked at it again, of course, I think it's deeper than that. I think of it as an exploration or meditation on the origin of malice. What is it that made Elmer D so violent? And maybe it's alien possession. You have a kind of something like the pod people from Vast Station, maybe, or his dad's exposure to Agent Orange when his dad was in Vietnam, or childhood sociopathy, etc. This story ends as though he in his narration is hunting for a reason that he's so evil, and it reminds me of I think what Samuel Coleridge, the poet, said about Iago, the character Iago in Othello, which is there's a scene where Iago's talking through all the reasons he hates Othello and wants to, get revenge on him, and Coleridge describes Iago's speech there as the motive hunting of a motiveless malignancy, and
Nice.
I love that. I learned that in my undergrad days, and I just have never forgotten that phrase. Is this stuff is starting to take place? His kind of resuscitation as a zombie, and all of these thoughts and the memories going back to even when he and Ferris were, I guess, early on in their relationship. All these things are happening after he gets hit on the head with a rock. I wonder if you care to comment on it. Is all of this just happening in his head, and his brain is spiraling down, and he's just kind of seeing his life before his eyes and trying to hunt for why it is that why he is so full of anger and malice. Because in particular, like there's a scene where he's he slaughters a bunch of people and he's eating their brains. You'd think that in the broader world there would be some, it would make it in the news stories, and it'd be something that Jessica as an old woman would be very aware of. But there doesn't seem to be any of that kind of awareness. So I kind of wonder, like, how much of this is really, after he gets hit in the head, is any of this stuff actually happening? Yeah, or any of your thoughts on it kind of being what you wanted to do with it in terms of it being like a play on a zombie story, maybe a reinvention of a zombie story.
Well, in my mind, there's the artist, conceit, and then there's what people get out of it. And I think it's another one of those cases where it's perfectly valid to say, no, this is his dying, dream. My mind, no, it happened, but yeah. It's not, but it's complicated because obviously there's a reality warping going around him. And I'm trying to think. I think I had watched Hannibal. I liked in Hannibal season 3, they give up on reality. In other words, everything happening in Hannibal season 3 really couldn't happen in it shouldn't happen in coherent fiction, but would definitely not happen in the real world. Everything's stylized. Yeah. Everything's kind of a visual metaphor for something. And I wanted to try to pull something like that off with the story. But that wasn't the important part about the story. In other words, once again, it doesn't matter whether it's really happening or whether he's imagining it, whether he really is some kind of almost godlike, because he's not just a zombie. That might be where he starts, but he's literally he's some kind of a super predator toward the end. He's like evolved or de-evolved into something completely inhuman. And there's a lot going on there, and I don't want to bore everybody with all the different things, but dissecting it. But I will say this: once again, I wanted to write a story that takes a trope or a tradition and do something different, put my own stamp upon it. The next thing, though, and this goes back to the person who just actually typed in a couple minutes ago and asked me about critics. This actually, that's very perceptive, because this is a story that I wasn't really responding to critics, but I was definitely responding to the idea that, or reinforcing the idea about why I write, about the characters that I write. Why do I tackle hard-boiled men and women. And I've said in the past that because there's infinite variety. There's no. I mean, I wrote a novella with a yakuza who sobs, when he is confronted with the overwhelming supernatural elements, or when things just get a little too rough beyond what he had planned. That even strong people can be tender, or they can be wounded in such a way that they show their emotions. And I've said that, but I felt like, no, I wanted to write a story that takes one of the most time-honored and revered by me and many others, the revenge narrative. Very seldom, and it happens. I love it. I applaud it when it happens. But very generally speaking, revenge is even if it destroys the person seeking it, we still are trained in cinema and literature to root for them. They are going after some dastardly person, and maybe they go too far, and we can question that, or maybe it's suicidal, and we can question that. But we very seldom question their motive in the first place. We just simply argue about their methods or the extremes, and I felt like, no, I want to indict you, because a lot of people are reading that. I think goes after the person who he thinks is having an affair with his wife, or maybe they were kind of having an affair. And I guarantee you that even though in real life we all wag our finger and go, you murderer, would-be murderer, there's plenty of people, especially people who love to read horror and crime and whatnot, are like, well, of course, get him. Because lots of people who think of themselves as civilized are rooting for the mouthy teenager to get his head chopped off as soon as possible in a slasher. We become savages when we watch, violent films, in the sense that, yeah, shoot that guy, torture him. I'd pull his nails off and he'd tell me what's going on. But in real life, everybody would be absolutely, and rightfully so, absolutely horrified by it.
Yeah.
I decided to take a leaf out of the Sopranos book. I remember the writers talked about this. They would lull you into thinking Tony Soprano, well, he's not that bad.
Yeah.
He's a bad guy dealing with other bad guys, until they murder a stripper who is just trying to get by in the world. She's a total innocent in that regard. And then they all cover up the murder. They go, okay, well, she's just, she's a hoe. Who cares? And now you're indicted. You're like, oh, I've been rooting for this scumbag. Or he kills one of his friends because it's convenient to do it. They yank you back. Well, I decided that, for years I have, been very non-judgmental with most of my characters, even the really scummy ones. I'm very judgmental of Elmer D. Elmer D's a fucking villain. He's a bad person, but you're lulled into it. And by the end, you find out that if his wife had shot him, probably would have been, righteous. However, I wasn't going to let her off the hook either, because that's the other thing, that somebody always has to quantify good, or at least neutrality, and the other person has to be black as the heart of night. I wanted to write one where now you're lulled into feeling like maybe she had a reason, to be monstrous toward him. But no, she's a hell bitch too. They kind of deserved each other in a way.
Yes. And actually, it is Elmer and Ferris who make something of a return appearance in So Easy to Kill, isn't it? It's a different version of it, but it is both of them right in there.
Yep. Elmer D is the Moriarty to her Sherlock, or the Joker to his Batman, or her Batman. Yep.
Yes. Bad Wolf asks quickly here, well, what is your favorite Genius Loci literary reference, or favorite Genius Loci story, Laird?
I don't know if it counts as one, but my favorite movie would be Sauna, which is, I believe the English translation or version of it is called Evil Rising. It's like 2007, 2008. One of the best horror films I've ever seen, and definitely one of the great Genius Loci stories. As far as reading, I would say The Willows. Although there's some argument about whether that would qualify, but I'm going to go with that it qualifies. That area there's something going on with that area.
Very nice, thank you. Good question there, Bad Wolf.
Willows by people haven't read it by Black.
Yep. Let's go to really quickly. Little Miss Queen of Darkness. I will say that I think Ed is a very plain name for a guy who's very flamboyant and colorful and opinionated. He's quite a character. I think though this is probably a good time to talk about the flat affect men because they're such a prominent part of the story. What's the origin of the flat affect men? Obviously, there's kind of a Michael Myers sort
Sure.
of feel to it, but it's a little bit more distinct than that. Where'd you come up with that idea?
Nightmares, but
Wow.
I went with the kind of, they're but they're not featureless. Some of them are grinning. They're stoics and ecstatics, but I wanted to play with the idea of the hockey mask and the Shatner mask, and as a nod, like all these stories, they're just riddled with pop culture references, and that we have, like, literally sort of subsumed into our subconscious as a culture these days, and so there's that. But as far as the origin of them, that house is a real house, or at least it's based on parts of it are real, being built into a bear den.
Yeah.
That actually happened. My grandparents, they built a house on top of a hill that was actually a hollow. It was hollow, and a bear had lived in it.
Wow.
And it was unfinished. In the basement, I remember as a child when we would stay over, I was kind of creeped out. There was a daylight, there was a bunch of windows, kind of a daylight basement, but when you went deeper underground, where the kids would sleep, and there was a pretty large family. I had quite a few cousins and uncles and nieces or aunts and stuff that were barely teenagers. They had, it's hard to describe this, but there weren't so much rooms as there were chambers, and the ones that were up against the outer chambers that were up against the hill itself would be concrete or blocks up to about 6 feet, 5 to 6 feet, and then unfinished dirt going back into the darkness. Like, I remember sleeping in one of the bunk beds, and my head is right there by dirt. There's dirt right there. If you shine a flashlight, there's no end to it. It narrows down, but it just keeps going back in there. Old roots sticking down and stuff like that.
Good grief.
Yeah, it was like a maze. Everybody had their rooms were separated by like blackout type curtains. There were curtains or beads or whatever hanging. And I remember my one uncle who was an avid reader. He's actually the uncle that he had the Savage Sword of Conan, just stacks of it, and I grabbed those at one point. But and started reading them. But his little chamber was like a monk's cell. It was like probably 6 feet by 4 feet, 5 feet wide, just enough to get a bed in there. And he had you wouldn't even know he was in there because he had like a blackout curtain, and he'd have a little like an old 1940s or 50s lamp in there, and he'd be going blind reading all his Edgar Rice Burroughs and Conan novels and whatnot, and his comics and everything. But yeah, that's where that came from.
Wow. Wild. Was there actually like a kind of a 3x3 kind of tunnel that went further back into the caves and stuff?
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. One of the rooms, that was a bathroom. There was the wall wasn't so high, and it was, instead of being a wide open area, it was very narrow, like a little tunnel, and it went back in.
Wow. Did you or any of your cousins or brothers crawl back, like way back into it at any time?
No. No. Not even. And another inspiration came for that story and setting it there, just the general bad vibes. I even lived there by myself one winter in my early 20s. Yeah, I had nowhere else to live, and so nobody was there. The place basically was abandoned for years. Wow. I stayed there. It was not no power, no nothing. It was creepy. And but my brother had done a sleepover there when he was very little. He was about 5 years old, and he saw somebody. He claims he did about daylight one morning, and there was a bunch of the kids sleeping, and the older people were either sleeping upstairs, they were sleeping in deeper into the complex. He was sleeping out, like where the light came out of the windows, the only windows down there. And there was a pool table. And us kids used to scratch the hell out of the pool table and play and do all this stuff. And he said, yeah, somebody was standing by the pool table looking at him when he woke up. He said, it was one of those things where he knew something was wrong, and he wakes up and he sees them standing there, and he thought it was one of our uncles because they were very tall and kind of rangy, lean people. He said, but as he opened his mouth to say something, and they were taller than they should be, and they were dead white. And he realized that's not anybody I know. It's a stranger just standing there about 6 feet away, looking at him. And they just kind of grinned, and they went like that. And then they crouched down behind the pool table and never came out.
Oh, geez.
And to this day, he says, no, because I've asked him many times since then. I said, do you think you dreamed it, or were you just kidding? He goes, no, that's what I saw. He goes, it was, I was terrified. He goes, and he was lying there for like an hour until it got bright and everybody got up. And then he told everybody, and everybody was like, yeah, okay. And, he's 5. That was it. So it doesn't really matter to me, the veracity of it. I said, yeah, that would be creepy. That would be creepy.
Yeah. Extremely creepy.
Right.
Let me see. Moving on to Ears Prick Up. We've talked about Ears Prick Up. We've talked about the Rex character in the past, and I don't want to belabor it, but it to me, and Edward and I have talked about this some, and what you're trying to accomplish with the Rex character is so fascinating, and I would just love for you to just kind of give us a sense of the challenge of trying to create that inner monologue, the inner perspective of Rex when he's a cybernetic dog with a positronic mind. He's got the something like the genetic memory of all the dogs who ever lived.
Right.
But he's also, it's just an incredibly complex character, but also there's something, his brain's is damaged at some point in the future. Tell us about kind of what you set out to create with Rex, and the challenge of writing a story from the dog's perspective.
Ironically, I've made it a lot harder on myself recently because I've been writing about I have been writing more stories about, or vignettes about Rex. He'll feature quite a bit in future, these fantasy stories I'm working on. You're going to see him. But I've actually been spending a lot more time writing about this dog named Mantooth. I just wrote a story from his perspective. And the reason that's relevant, that was far harder because I was forced to write it from what I consider his intellect level to be, which is very childlike and yet not a child. Rex is difficult in some regards, but easier in others, simply because I can have him communicate with the audience in less strained and less patois. In other words, he does have the capability to communicate at a very high level. That's easy for me to write that because he speaks as a human would speak.
Yes,
but his subconscious or his other personality, that's his dominant personality. But his core personality is that of he's a dog. He's a dog, so he really has two personalities struggling. And for me, the big challenge with him is just a little bit of that coming in, not too much of it. I want, it's very easy to fall into the trap of, I'm writing from the perspective of a woman, or of a murderer, or of a dog, a monster, whatever it is, right? Something outside my direct experience. It's very easy just to say, if you're not looking at it closely, it could be any of it. It's a human narrative. It's a human voice. So the hard part for me with Rex is getting that balance right. What I set out to do, though, that's like just a technical difficulty. The goal with Rex was simply, I love to write about dogs. I wanted to write about from the perspective of a dog, but intelligibly, and maybe even multiple stories. I also wanted Rex, for me, he's a mythical figure. I wanted to write from the point of view of something that's mythical, like a Cerberus, or the of the Nemean lion or something like that, or the Minotaur. Setting aside whether they're villainous or whatever, I've always wanted to write from the perspective of a non-human entity that has mythological qualities, and that isn't like a super evil or amoral creature. I wanted something that we could relate to. They have
Mm-hmm.
loves and hates and loyalties and fears and so forth. And that was the goal with Rex.
I mean, Rex is. I love one of the aspects of Ears Prick Up that I love so much is that he is so tender toward his mom and dad, the two humans who care for him, and he also just loves killing people, loves going into battle and killing dad's enemies, the enemy.
Right.
It is both very tender, and he's both tender and vicious at the same time. And when he does what he is supposed to do, which is destroy dad's enemies, then he's pleased with himself. Dad is pleased with him, and all is right with the world. It is such a strange kind of amalgamation of those two perspectives.
Well, dogs are remorseless. They are what especially different breeds. I mean, I don't think you could take a Labrador and get the same kind of effect as you would training a pit bull or a mastiff or a Rottweiler or an Alsatian or something. Some animals are genetically, we've meddled with their genetics to the point where they're born and bred to have certain inclinations, but which makes them beautiful, and also it's kind of terrifying. You don't want them to fall in the wrong hands. But
Yeah.
I will say this: I've had many dogs, been around many dogs, and the sweetest Labrador that wouldn't hurt a fly, if they think that for whatever reason they get it in their head to eat a squirrel, they will, and feel nothing. They'll kill a baby rabbit, and yet they're still that sweet creature. They're not evil. They simply have a different moral compass than we do. They're doing right. Every time our dog, old Valentina, she savagely barks at intruders. She doesn't hate people or anything like that. She simply is doing her job. See, I scared them off, Dad. And if they're allowed in the house, then they must be okay. It's okay then. I'll hang out with them.
Yeah.
I wanted to, touch on that with Rex, is that also is what sets him apart from a human being, though. Human beings don't unless they're sick in the head. They're people that can compartmentalize that are terrifying. Dogs, it's actually I won't say cute, but it's understandable. We understand that a police dog will rip Chopper sick balls, and we're like, well, the dog was trained to do that. Now he's playing with newborns. He's playing with kittens or whatever because he wasn't ordered to eat them. He probably would eat them if he was told to.
Yeah.
So, but he would still be this essentially innocent. There's an innocence about animals.
Dogs going and eating. When he goes and eats the squirrel, he's just asserting his place in the food chain.
Yeah.
That's just kind of naturally what they do. Yeah, and
Right.
we don't think of that as being wrong.
And they're innocent in a way that a human being never would be, unless they were very young. So the innocence of Rex is or of any of the dogs that I write about is one of my attractions to writing about them.
I love that. And people really, I think, really respond to the way you characterize and embrace dogs in your stories. And Strident Collar is one that I know is coming up in Not a Speck of Light. And it's just a very touching story about a man who's, missing his dog. And it's a lot more than that. Let me see. Jumping back to Ears Prick Up, just one other question that I've got on it. I was, going back and reading Screaming Elk, Montana. I was surprised that I had not remembered that it was doctors Ryoko and Campbell who were inventing Rex. I wonder if you're getting like early designs and they're debating the ethics of kind of putting a AI or a positronic brain into an animal. Just thinking about how we see Rex and Ears Prick Up. You've referred to Ears Prick Up as an antiquity story. This is not like the kind of the Jessica Mace, Isaiah Coleridge reality. 2 million years in the future. It really is like your second world fantasy world.
Yeah, that's how I see it. And as far as Screaming Elk, my feeling is that does take place in our timeline, and that the Rex that they're working on is probably not the Rex from Ears Prick Up.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
I just reread
Go ahead. What?
I just reread Tomahawk Park Survivor's Raffle. Mr. Speck is drawing a picture of him. It's like 2 sentences, but he's in the diner and he draws a picture. So that was a cool catch that I just discovered.
Yeah, it's not to say that there isn't a Rex in this timeline that isn't, that I'm not saying that there's not going to be a cyborg dog in this line, but I don't think, in my mind, is there's another universe where this goes a lot further than it's going to go here.
Real quick, just one question about Black Dog. This was your first of the Swift to Chase stories. This was the first to be published. Right before, I think, and then several came out the next year.
Sure.
But the unnamed man, unnamed woman, something about the unnamed woman's, just like how sharp she is, how smart, witty, and also that she can take care of herself. I just wondered, is she like a prefiguring or an early version of Jessica Mace, or is it just completely different?
I left it like that as well.
Okay.
Well, she and Jessica Mace are both based on real people, so that's why. There's no, but it's not. I saw at some point somebody wondered if it really was just Jessica Mace. I just didn't name her, which would have been pretty damn clever, but that's not. The identity of either one of them is immaterial.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Very good. Thank you. Edward, did you want to ask about Slave Arm?
Yeah. So, and this was really interesting. This was the other one I wrote up on the subreddit. I had this thought after reading this again that if you took all of the horror element, like the global conspiracy, the cosmic horror, the supernatural, the flat affect, it's just about this poor bastard who has to keep reliving this horrible thing that happened, right? This attempted murder and then the witnessing of the murder. And Laird, you actually gave a really great interview in 2016 on a site called Smash Dragons, and the guy was Australian. What you said was, it is probably more accurate to say my work focuses on gritty characters undergoing trauma. Those are the most prevalent elements. It made me wonder if you'd been doing that the whole time, but I just figured it out. Like, Imago Sequence are all these hard-boiled characters. They're going through these horrific traumas. I just wondered if you cared to expand on that at all.
No, that's, when I talk about there's infinite variety in writing about, say, noir / crime characters. Like, if you just focus on that, to me, there's infinite, relatively speaking, or practically speaking, there's an infinite variation possible with Steve McQueen and Robert Redford characters and the villains. There's anything from Charles Bronson or Lee Van Cleef playing a villain to Henry Fonda in Once Upon a Time in the West. I mean, God, you expect Jack Palance to be a villain. He acts like one. He mugs. He does all that. So does Lee Van Cleef. Henry Fonda is a beautiful man who is renowned for playing beautiful, sweet people generally, at least not hired gunfighters. And yet, just as comedians are often the best dramatic actors for psychopaths and whatnot, I think sometimes someone playing against type, who's also a good actor, makes the greatest villain. But I feel like I could focus on only writing about hard-boiled characters until I die, and always have something else to investigate. It's like you'll never exhaust writing about love or death. I figure that I could write about these characters forever. I have no interest in only writing about them from a artistic standpoint. There's other things I'd like to do, but certainly it's my preoccupation. And seeing them under pressure is what, because I'm certainly not the only person or the first person to ever twig to the idea of let's take someone that's hyper capable instead of someone who's just ordinary or even effete, and squishing them under the under oppressive dread. Let's put a soldier in that circumstance, someone who's very capable, or a detective, or a hitman, or whatever. I'm not the first person or the only. That's become quite an honored tradition, but it's what interests me. It interests me not just that when they're under pressure, but they don't necessarily have an arc, especially in a short story. And I think it's a fallacy or a myth to believe that a character arc is important. I look at it like exposing what they know or maybe don't know about themselves, but they're revealed. Their interior is revealed. It's like cracking open a piece of fruit and looking at all the seeds in it, or you open up a dollhouse and all of a sudden you see all the rooms in it. It's not that anything changes. It's all there. It's simply that that circumstances reveal what they are, who they are, why they are the way they are. And I also think that we make a big deal about heroes suffering trauma. It brings us closer to them. I like the fact that a lot of my characters are not redeemed by anything that happens in the story. So therefore, they may not be villains, but they're certainly not always heroes. They're anti-heroes a lot of the time. And yet, their trauma is what interests me about them. And a lot of times buried trauma being revealed. I really feel like the secret to good horror, probably probably almost any kind of related type of literature, is revelation.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants to know, even if it's, you know what? I mean, you take a period romance. Will she get the man? Is she going to land the inheritance? Or in modern, contemporary times, will she get the job? Will he, will his dark past be revealed? But it doesn't have to be anything truly dramatic, but we're just hooked on finding out, how did I meet your mother? Who was writing the Gossip Girls? That kind of thing. It doesn't even have to, the stakes don't have to be very high at all compared to murder, mayhem, destroying the planet. And I feel like revelation is the key. I like to explore why these people are the way they are. Why are they reacting the way they're reacting? And I think that putting people who are not necessarily the stereotypical hero through their paces, for me, that's more interesting technically as a writer. And so I do it as often as I can.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. One question just came up. Redcon Rex asks, what in horror fiction is most frightening to you? A monster, a concept, a situation? What scares you the most when you think about it?
It's a great question.
That's an excellent question. I appreciate it. That's the second great question that you've asked, Rex. I think, like many writers, or I should say even broaden it to people who love horror, horror doesn't really scare me generally. Horror, for me, it's a lens to explore things that actually scare me in a safe way. So I would have to say the stuff that disquiets me the most, though, or gets me thinking, are people committing acts that go against their nature. So in other words, it's not even necessarily confined to horror. I find myself viscerally reacting in a visceral way to another infamous trope, which is, you'll see it in crime and war, where someone's a good person or a mediocre person, perhaps, but they're harmless until the bag of money falls out of the back of the fleeing vehicle and they have it. Now, what am I going to do? Or they're presented with an opportunity. And the next thing they know, their life, the first murder begets another murder, and the stakes keep escalating. Even though that's cliched and it's usually portrayed as sort of zany, the heart of it, the squirming underbelly of it, is that we're all, as the comic said, the Batman comic said, we're just one bad day away from being the villain. And that is something that bothers me. Like I would say, like, one of the most terrible, psychically damaging stories I ever read was Child of God by McCarthy. And why? Not because he was skinning people, eventually descended into savagery and was raping corpses, and no, not that. The part, though, where he became more and more feral because he had been disenfranchised, disinherited from his land, essentially, and was outside the compact that mankind shares across cultures, that he had been relegated to sort of this primordial state against his will. We lived a bit better than that, but not a lot. And my father did criminal activities because of justifying, well, we're broke. And I think anyone's capable of some of the things my father did, if they're hungry enough, depressed. I mean, you see it in a lot of disenfranchised youth. They join gangs, they run drugs, they steal, they mug. Well, they have to be held accountable for the consequences of what they brought. If you step back, a lot of those people with different circumstances never would have, if they hadn't been put in that situation, they wouldn't have shot a clerk in a store, right? And that should frighten all of us, because I'm not saying everybody would ever do that. Of course not. But enough would. Everybody has a breaking point. And any kind of horror or crime or thriller, noir, that reveals that always is something that disquiets me.
Thank you. Great answer there. Edward, you want to kind of wrap this up with Tomahawk Park Survivors Raffle?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I just sat and reread this before the webcast tonight. I had a thought, and this is just a minor question, but when we first meet Mr. Speck, it reminded me of Randall Flagg from The Stand. He's sitting in the diner and he's got like a cowboy hat on, like he's like wearing like Alaskan kind of hip gear or whatever. Was that intentional, or did I just make that up?
No, that's not intentional. Although, once again, I feel like I'm an ecstasy of influence personality, and therefore, even if I don't consciously recognize something, when it's pointed out, I have a tendency to go, if it fits, I'm like, yeah, because the Stand was pretty influential on me, especially Flagg's character. Flagg's one of the most terrifying villains in literature because, for me personally, because I don't know how often I was out in the trail as a kid by myself, walking with the sled dogs, hitchhiking, whatever. And I ran away from home a couple times, had some troubled weeks in my youth. And I remember stuff that would go through my mind, just, fleeing down the highway. Like, what if somebody was walking down the trail after me? And I started thinking about Randall Flagg. So it wasn't a conscious choice, but Stephen King, I mean, he's had a major influence on all of us horror writers. And while we're on that subject, I would just like to detour and say, I owe Stephen Graham Jones, in particular for this collection, I owe him quite a bit of credit. Not because he directly we talked about anything, or I don't really think most of my stories are quite like his, but I look to him as kind of a guiding spirit when I was writing this, or a guiding light, because I changed my style. I remember talking to John Langan. I said, okay, I'm writing full time now. I need to write in a different way than I've been writing in the past. And, John just said, well, you need to experiment and figure it out. And I was reading a lot of Stephen Graham Jones, or had been reading a lot of Stephen Graham Jones, and he has this very free-flowing, there's always forward motion to his writing. And sometimes it's even almost oblique how he comes to certain conclusions in his stories, and what he'll leave out. Like some of his stories, you have to read between the lines. And I was very much influenced by him.
The only other thing, I know we're kind of getting to the end of our time, it felt like the story, we had talked on Patreon once, and I had acknowledged the first time I read Swift to Chase, I felt like you outsmarted me a bit, and you gave me this really thoughtful response about it being kind of a loosely connected mosaic and push-pulls, but not neatly. Some of the things you said earlier in this webcast tonight, this story felt very emblematic of that to me. Like, the story felt emblematic of the collection. Like, you meet this detective, and then she hires him, and then, like, flash forward, the guy's dead, and then that, we don't see from that guy again. Like, Julie Vellum pops in at the end, and that's, like, maybe later in her life, but a lot of this stuff seems like it's earlier. One thing I was going to ask, there's a reference. So the two doctors that we know and love, there's 3 non-human intelligences interfering with life on Earth. They know about 2 of them. The 2 they know, is that Old Leech and the Gray Eminence? And then there's one that is not yet revealed to us?
Well, I'd have to look at it again. If it's the doctors talking about it, they may or may not know about Old Leech. They would be aware of the Beatles. They're directly in contact with them.
I thought of the forest. When I was reading this story, I thought of your story, The Forest, because of the doctors and that whole...
Right. So, in my mind, Old Leech would be the least likely that they would be aware of, because Old Leech doesn't directly mess around on Earth as much. It has basically representatives, but the Beatles, or whatever they are, the Beatles, there's that word. Obviously, the doctors were quite aware of him, and I've written other stories where the Gray Eminence is something that is lurking beneath the Atlantic off the coast, the East Coast, obviously off the East Coast. So that would be, it's debatable, but that would be the two that I would think that they're referring to.
Very nice. Awesome. Thank you so much. There's one other. Bad Wolf asks this. That would be.
Wondering this too.
Yes, and Edward, I saw that in your notes. There's a reference to Amanda Boll.
Oh, Bolle.
Amanda Boll. Yes.
Yeah.
It's Tom Mandible.
Mandibola. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Actually, the way I spell it, it could be pronounced Bowl. Actually, I think a lot of people probably would say Bowl. Yeah. Well, we'll see more about that, but yeah, it's possible that Mr. Bolle is also, Mrs. Bolle, and maybe even non-binary Bolle.
Yeah. Okay, so as we wrap up, Laird, again, thanks for giving us so much of your time. Sure. I wanted to remind everyone that on this Sunday night, I'm in conversation. Edward and I are back in conversation with Laird and bringing Brian Evanson as well to talk about their new collections dropping on September 10. Not a Speck of Light from Laird, and from Brian we have Good Night, Sleep Tight. I believe this will be the first time you guys have been like in a joint interview, and I'm really excited just to kind of get commentary from both of you on themes that you both take on in your work. And we'll be I think pretty spoiler free with this in terms of the stories coming up, and I'd love to talk about kind of themes and just your approach to fiction of the weird. And yeah, anything is going on, Laird, over in your space that you'd like us to know about?
Well, I'm looking forward to being on there with Brian. I frequently refer to him as one of the great, living horror writers, weird fiction writers. I consider him and Stephen Graham Jones and Kelly Link and Jeff Ford, John Langan, Paul Tremblay, that group is some of the the best. And I think he could even be at the top of the list. He's really, really good. So I'm looking forward to that. I will say this, that on that day, Ellen Datlow has an anthology called Fears coming out, and it's a bunch of reprint stories about. Actually, I don't have the jacket in front of me, but essentially, it's about, I want to say, mostly human type of nemesis, villains and whatnot, but it's about things, the horrible things that people do, essentially. And I have a story in there. Matter of fact, LD50 is in there. So,
very good. Yes,
I'm pretty sure Brian has a story in there too. So I'm looking forward to that.
And if you have not, to our viewers, if you have not visited Laird's Patreon site, definitely go out and take a look at that. Laird's adding in content every week, and now actually has some kind of read audio narration of some stories and other stuff in there that's a lot of fun. You've got getting close to 600 members, almost 200 actually paying subscribers, and that's just continuing to become richer and richer. Any tease, any hint on what we have coming up in the next month or so on your Patreon site?
Nothing specific. I just say that I've started recording some of the material. I'm going to be releasing more and more stories that are in dual format. Stories, poems, my essays and whatnot, and probably at least some of the posts, just the daily posts where I recommend books, movies, games, whatever, or even just give you some quotidian details about what I've been going through previous week. I'm going to try to offer dual format more and more as I go along. Eventually, I at least want to go back through and record all the major essays and the stories and poems I've previously released. And then going forward, I think everything will have an audio and a text component.
Awesome.
And
Yes.
I'm also thinking for the years out, I'll probably have some limited video too. I promised that. I just haven't gotten around to that yet. I'm doing the audio though, because I realize that it's functionally different from text. Video and text are pretty similar. You have to stare at the screen and absorb it that way. But I feel as if, and this was one of the patrons, requested it and advised that I should try it. Recordings, you can, listen to me read a poem or a story or narrate an essay while you're doing something else. So.
Absolutely. Or driving. Yeah. Taking my run, that kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely.
So ultimately, there will be a massive amount of text and audio, and then ultimately also some video on the site. Cool.
Love that. Love to hear that. And then if you're watching this and you're not part of the subreddit, the Laird Barron subreddit community, we've got 1,100 or so members now, and there's great conversations going on in these threads. We've extended the read along to cover all the stories and Not a Speck of Light. Chicken Dragon 123 is also doing Man with No Name, and we use swords in the 70s, and he's talking about covering some other stories that are even outside of this upcoming collection. So very excited about that. And
may I just say I appreciate. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I just want to just tell the community, you guys in particular for spearheading it, but just the community in general. And I'm well aware of Chicken Dragon and the work, and I think RoboCop.
RoboCop, yeah.
Yeah, but in general, I don't, I'll forget people, so I'll keep it to thank you. I do pop in and look. I don't want to interject because I feel that's not my place to correct or to advise or to confirm, but I love it. I feel as if I'm really privileged in all the hard work, the community. I mean, the questions are just really great questions, and I appreciate the care and the diligence that you all have exhibited toward my work. It's, outside of keeping a roof over my head, the most important thing for me as an artist is that people engage with what I do. And I really could not ask for more than what that subreddit has given me. And I really appreciate all you folks. And before I forget, there was one thing that's happening next month. Starting, God's willing, all the month of October is going to be, I'm actually going to be releasing narrated. I'm going to do audio files of a bunch of scary things, weird things that have happened to me and relatives and friends. So like one a day for the month of October.
Awesome.
I did this on Twitter a few years ago.
Yes.
I'm basically going to take those and I'm going to put them back up because they're not available anywhere. I'm going to post those every day. I may edit them a bit and change because I have more room to work with, but I'm going to narrate them. They'll be 3 to 8 minute long pieces. And they're going to be available for anybody at any level that joins the Patreon. So if you wanted to subscribe on the free level just to check it out, you'll be able to do that. That's going to start, like I said, if all goes well, I plan to start on the 1st and carry one a day all the way through Halloween.
That's fantastic to hear. I remember that Twitter thread, and man, there's some really, really freaky things going on that you've experienced, and I'm so glad that you'll be narrating that now with your own voice. Very excited to hear that. So, all right, but again, thanks everyone so much for joining us. This conversation will be available in perpetuity on YouTube Live, and I'll put it out on the Cathonica podcast at some point as well. Okay, thanks for joining us, everyone, and we will be back in a couple of days to talk to Laird and Brian. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.